And hi, Valentina.
Hello. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm a little bit irritated today, and yeah, which kind of brings us down to a very, very relevant topic for us today, as we want to be talking about anger.
Absolutely. I think a very relevant topic for anyone anywhere, because as we'll get on to later, anger is one of these emotions that's often a mask or a kind of a leading emotion that covers others that are more complex.
Definitely. So stay tuned in. What we want to cover today is we want to look at what is anger. What is the purpose of that as an emotion from evolutionary perspective? When and why do we feel angry, and why is it so difficult to regulate some of those anger outbursts when we are triggered or when we are in specific situations? But also, we want to look at how anger as an emotion is a social construct. And for example, why is it acceptable for men to display anger, but not for women, right? Also, we want to look at how some of those concepts are constructed through our history, through our childhood, through our bringing, and all of these other layers of emotions that are actually hiding underneath that anger, where anger is really just kind of the external mask, like Valentina mentioned. So yeah, so Valentina, I know that from even your own anthropological research, when you're looking at kind of evolution of human beings and different emotions and different social constructs, what is anger, from that evolutionary perspective, and why we need it.
Yeah. So anger is one of these emotions that can be a real motivating emotion, motivator for action. And it often, we see it come up in our everyday lives now, as one where, and I think we'll kind of get onto this a little bit more later as well, but where anger is an emotion where you're seen as and understood to have more power than with a lot of other emotions, and more agency than with a lot of other emotions. And that's why it often gets or becomes the mask for other emotions, because we would rather experience an emotional energy as anger, because it makes us feel sometimes more powerful and more of an agent in the situation, than emotions where, you know, potentially we have to recognize our lack of control, and where we might feel more passive and withdrawn.
Yeah.
So anger plays a really important role socially in that way, but also in terms of kind of regulating social dynamics as a reaction to perceived injustice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when talking about that kind of perceived injustice, and perceived is a key there as well, right? Because it can be, now anger is our response to threat, right? And therefore, the purpose of anger from from that evolutionary perspective is to protect ourselves, right? To display, that power to kind of go into that fight flight mode, when you can stand out for yourself, you can stand out for your values and beliefs. And this, threat and the concept of self protection is not just about a physical threat and physical kind of protection, but it's also when somebody steps on your values, on your beliefs, and some of the injustices that have been done to you. It's really kind of shows the anger can be indicator of some of our personal barriers, and some of our personal values have been invaded, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that kind of looking at the things that we hold closest, and the things that are often the most important in terms of our identity and our safety. And it's those boundaries and those beliefs that, when they are crossed, are normally the ones that stimulate the greatest anger response. And it will be often beliefs around human beings and how society should operate, what is expected within social dynamics, within relationship dynamics, within working dynamics. And a crossing of boundaries, exactly like you say, can be a real trigger for anger because of that sense of injustice. So often it threatens safety because we erect our boundaries in all sorts of ways in our lives, physical boundaries in our homes and spatial boundaries and wanting to have private time, but also boundaries in our relationships about the things that we do and don't want to talk about, or the kinds of behaviors we do and don't want to welcome within a relationship or a social dynamic. And so anger is often the first emotion that comes up as a response to feeling that any of those boundaries have been crossed, because that is then, it's kind of almost like the oldest regulatory kind of social regulatory force, because it exerts a level of power, or it expresses that displeasure in a really obvious way.
Definitely. And here, when we're talking about triggers that you are, mentioning about some of those, boundaries being triggered, and some of kind of the levels of injustice that we feel, and sense of our safety, security, privacy values have been invaded at that in that sense. What is also very important to kind of look into is that people who, okay, let's say, would come to us for coaching, they say, I need help managing my anger, right? They usually think that anger is nearly, there is some external source that made them angry, right? Like, you made me angry, like somebody else did this and they made me angry, something happened and they made me angry, right? So here is very, very important that anger in itself is not something that comes from the external environment and enters your emotional state, right? It's those external environments are triggers that actually touches something within us. And if we look at those triggers and some of those anger outbursts as an indicator of what are some of those values, what are some of those boundaries that have been stepped over, what is it about it that makes my anger step out, and I feel like I need to now defend and protect myself, right? What is it that's specifically been stepped on? And if we look at it from this perspective, it can be a wonderful exercise for self-awareness, because you can really learn a lot about your values and beliefs that are actually consciously we're not aware of, right?
Absolutely. And that's why I think that it's such an interesting topic, because it's often, like we mentioned before, this leading emotion, and an emotion that people can run into problems with. But holds this amazing insight into what we hold closest to us. So that will be our greatest sensitivities, in terms of our emotional sensitivities, maybe triggers from past experiences, dynamics, early dynamics, but also our closest beliefs and values. And when we are more aware of our sensitivities and our beliefs and values, then we have a much clearer sense of our purpose, what is meaningful to us, what also creates our well-being, and also what motivates our behaviors. So those things are all really, really essential for creating good well-being and for creating a happy life and feeling a sense of contentment and stability.
Yeah, I love how we mentioned the meaning and purpose, because what came to my mind as you were talking here is there's this talk by a guy called David Logan, and he talks about the dark side of human beings, of the world, of emotions, and how we can use that as a motivating driver to fuel our intentions. And, very often when we look at the concept of setting goals and creating a better world, we are encouraging people to dream of, what is the ideal that you want to see in a world. But what he looks at, he actually takes it to the other side and he says, you know what? Most of the reasons for innovation, most of the drivers for creating something, some solutions for world's biggest problems, actually came out of this huge frustration and injustices with the way things are in the world, right?
Yeah.
And he said, what are some of those things that really gets you so much that you cannot not do anything about it, right? And it really can be a way, a window into understanding some of those our core values and principles. What do I really truly care about, and how does it manifest in this world, and therefore how can I use it as a fuel to drive my motivation? And he used Steve Jobs as one of the examples of that, because he said he will, he made that statement of technology sucks, right?
Yeah.
It's useless, it's frustrating, it's like all of these things, right? And it's that frustration of how kind of poorly designed and how unintuitive technology was at that state that drove him to create, kind of drive these different processes that are now we take it for granted, right? So I think really on what you said, it's so important, because definitely that anger can be a window to understanding our motivation, understand some of these drivers and principles to help us tap into our purpose and motivation.
Certainly. And I think often we can be motivated by anger into certain behaviors that, it will have that motivating force, but we then can have the choice about what we want it to motivate. Whereas often where we run into problems with anger is when it motivates behaviors and we don't feel like we have a choice, and we can become locked onto an individual or a situation that actually engaging our anger with that in that circumstance isn't going to be productive for us, other people, or the situation as a whole, and actually can end up perpetuating a problem and breaking down communication. And so by learning to kind of investigate our anger, then we can utilize it, just like you say, to drive our motivation in a way where we actually have a bit more choice, but also where we end up avoiding some of the behaviors that can cause problems for us, having arguments with people and lacking the ability to empathize. I think a lot of the time anger can really get in the way of empathy. And empathy is a really important component, not just for having good relationships, but for understanding society, social dynamics, but also getting a wide enough perspective to get outside of ourselves, outside of our own egos and our own situation, so that we can empathize with other belief systems, other people, other needs, other sensitivities. And that really, really helps foster a sense of contentment within ourselves, because we just step back and widen the zoom and widen our perspectives. And so learning how to read our anger can really, really help with also developing empathy and kind of engaging with these other emotions that can be more useful.
Absolutely. And I really like that you are touching on the concept of empathy here, because if you feel threatened, you go into the defense mode. The moment you are in defense mode, it becomes all about me. It's all about survival. It's all about protecting my own needs, my own beliefs, and my own values. And the moment you go into that mode, you cannot possibly see other options and other people's worlds of view, which prevents us from being empathic and really understanding what maybe other people think about the situation. And also, I think what is crucial to understand that sometimes we label certain emotions as good and bad. And anger is one of those emotions, as we say, anger is bad. Well, anger in itself is not bad. It's how we express it that can be either constructive or destructive, right?
And
it's about those behaviors. How we choose to, anger in itself is an energy, it's fuel, right? And how we choose to apply it, again, like with every tool, right? I can give you a hammer and you can use it to destroy something, or we can use it to build something. And it's the same with anger. Anger is just an energy, it's just a tool, it's just a motivation. Where you're going to apply it and how you're going to use it, that's going to make that source of energy as a power to create something better, or to destroy yourself, others, relationships, and so on.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to recognize the way we attribute value to anger. So, having this idea of anger as bad, that causes problems in the sense of, sometimes we don't allow ourselves to express anger. And sometimes it can really be so deeply embedded, and especially in women, and we'll get into this a bit more detail in a minute, but that actually to the point where you don't feel anger. And that then means that you aren't as likely to protect your boundaries. You aren't as likely to feel motivated to action with your, from a circumstance or with your emotions. And also it means that you often don't get perceived as somebody who will exert power or agency. And there are lots of very healthy ways to express anger, that it doesn't, expressing anger isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it's not necessarily destructive. It can be really constructive. But if we express it in a way where we can truly communicate how we're feeling and communicate clearly about the situation, at the same time as empathizing with others, then it can be an incredible driving force for change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think definitely, when we're looking at, what happens when we suppress that anger, and you can, you'll definitely see those patterns especially in women, because again, women are much more likely to suppress their anger because it's just not socially accepted for women to be angry. And therefore, we are kind of trained to be a good girl, and we take it to the extent where we think anger is bad, and you don't even know how to tap into that anger as a source of energy in a healthy way. And it can lead to ending up in abusive relationships, as we were discussing in our previous session. It could lead to you not having boundaries, and not knowing how to say no, right? And always saying yes to everything, and putting other people's needs first. So anger in itself is very, very important in that. And there are different ways of how we can express it in a very healthy and constructive way. So it shows that, we have power, we have agency, we have values, we have boundaries, and you better not cross those, right? So yeah.
Certainly. And I think what's important to think about when we look at this kind of male, female, to kind of use a binary distinction with how we hold anger, obviously there'll be lots of individuals who this won't be the case for. But as a whole, and in general, for men to express anger has been really shown and in society to be something that's valuable, something that makes them more masculine, which is seen as more valuable for men, and something which also shows them as kind of powerful and agents, but powerful in a way that is a lot more narrow than, say, a power that comes from a wider perspective and ability to empathy. There's a huge amount of power and empathy, the ability to understand others and connect with others. I mean, we are founded on relationships, we are founded on connections. As a human race, we wouldn't get by without them. There's a true underlying power within empathy, but that's not how we perceive it in society. We perceive power a lot more in anger, and men are a lot more likely to express that anger physically as well, and in outward expressions of aggression of all sorts, because of this cultural and social dynamic that has this boys will be boys narrative, and it makes it a lot more permissible, but also holds it up as some kind of signifier of greater masculinity. And actually, then the effect that that has on women is it makes, so the flip side of that is that anger is seen as not a feminine emotion, and to be less feminine as a woman is understood as being less valuable. And it means that, exactly like we were saying, so anger often gets repressed within women, but also that women are then more likely to meet the anger and aggression of men than the other way around, because of that dynamic whereby women sit in this camp where they've been taught not to show that kind of power and show that kind of anger, which means they're often the receivers because they are less likely to meet that anger with more anger. They're often the receivers of the anger and the aggression from men. And that's why you often see, again, going a little bit back to our discussion last week, that's why you do often see in abusive relationships where anger that in a heterosexual relationship, anger that a man experiences or is triggered by outside of the relationship then gets released inside the relationship, because of this dynamic in which women are not allowed to express their anger in the same way. But there's something else.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, when we're looking at that in a concept of relationships in, kind of more traditional male and female partnership, you really see those dynamics that, like you mentioned, women are more likely to actually balance out the anger with the opposite, right? Which means that they will go more into themselves, they will retract more, they will step back, and actually will become much more empathetic in a way, trying to understand why is this person feeling this way, and is there anything, once you connect with that emotion, then you start nearly like justifying and understanding that the reason why they behaved because of those circumstances, because of their upbringing, because of my behavior, because so on. So you're becoming much more embedded in that narrative of that world of view from the other end of the extreme, to the point where you are now accepting and accepting, to the point that now you lose your own sense of agency internally, right? It's not just because somebody else tells you that you're not allowed to do that, but because of that constant expression of anger, you feel it's not worth retaliation, it's not worth standing up for yourself, it's not worth doing those other things, because it will create more conflict, it will create more anger, it will create more of those destructive behaviors. Therefore, you will do everything you can to pacify that situation and to kind of, in a way, step back and not retaliate. While men respond to it very, very differently, right? So if women respond towards men with aggression, they will try to kind of fight over by having higher level of aggression, right? And therefore, like a lot of male conflict can be really, really confrontational, because every person is trying to show that they're more powerful by displaying a little bit more of that aggression, right? And it doesn't always come in physical fight and so on. You can see in exactly the same way how power dynamics play out, let's say, in political conversations, right? You observe politicians defending their points of view, you will see this aggression as a dominance of trying to be more powerful, to have more control, to have more information, to have more ways of standing up for yourself in a way that kind of diminishes other individual in that way, right? So your power comes at the cost of someone else. While for women, it's sometimes opposite, right? It's like you give your power away at the cost of your own boundaries.
Certainly, and that often gets internalized, and that anger can turn inwards. And rather, when we don't feel such a strong sense of agency, then we perceive that we can't actually make effects and changes in our environments, then we often turn that emotion, as in this case anger, on ourselves, because we think, okay, if I can't control the external things, then maybe I can control the internal things. And actually we spend so much of our energy and time trying just to change ourselves, and without realizing that actually we can sometimes remove ourselves from the external environment, and we can influence our external environment, but we don't feel as motivated to do so, because we don't feel that we're going to have the kind of the impact that we want to. And I think it's really useful to be aware of this in a work context and in office environments, and just notice where, you know, where in your communications, who is permitted to express anger and who isn't, and how is that perceived when anger is expressed by some people, how is that perceived, and how is that perceived when anger is expressed by others. We've talked about this male-female dynamic, but there's also a lot of racial stereotypes around anger as well, and a lot of people from Black and Asian backgrounds will feel that they have to be extra careful about the way they express anger, because for anticipating that there will be these stereotypes of aggression and anger based on their race. And so I think it's really important to notice how these things get expressed within a working environment, because that will affect whose opinions and ideas are heard more, and therefore who feels more comfortable in the space, and also who is more likely to progress in a working environment as well.
And it's also the same applies to different cultures, right? There are certain cultures where it just simply, where it's not okay. Let's say in a lot of Eastern countries, it's not okay to display anger as well, right? So there are also sort of kind of cultural connotations as well, where we're having much more global, working environments, and people travel and so on, that it's understanding how these different social constructs. Now, emotions are universal, right? We all feel anger, we all feel frustration, we all feel, love, guilt, shame, all of those. But the way we express it, the expression of it, is a social construct. And we learn that through our upbringing, through our social ecosystem, through these kind of rules of social engagement that we have in our society. And as an organization, you also create those rules of engagement of how different people can express themselves, and how certain expression of specific thoughts, emotions, feelings are more acceptable than others, and for some people are more acceptable than others. So it can be really, really useful way to understand the dynamics of your own organizational culture and how really inclusive you are, because it's not just about having those different genders, races, and so on included in your workplace. It's how they are being perceived in their ability to be themselves, and to bring their own culture and values and beliefs without being silenced for some of those specific aspects of their identity, right?
Certainly. And I think if you are kind of looking at your organizational dynamics, I think really thinking about certain emotions, anger being a big one and an important one, thinking about how those emotions get expressed, or how they are perceived when expressed by different groups, I think can be a really useful starting point for just building some self-awareness around your unconscious bias, because we all have unconscious bias. And the key, it's not necessarily about getting rid of it. We can't always be successful in that way, because it's programmed often from a really young age, and from kind of everywhere in our society. But these unconscious biases we can choose to respond differently to. And the more awareness that we have around them, then the more choice we have around how we're responding to them. And therefore, then in a working environment, how we can create cultures and spaces in which everyone is heard for what they are expressing, rather than how us layering our perception of their what their emotion means, where it's coming from.
But also understanding that because anger is a kind of expression of individual safety, and individual boundaries have been somehow invaded and broken, we can also, can also be a reason for toxic culture, where some of those individual boundaries are constantly being stepped on or stepped over because of, the way people interact, communicate, because of the way we, expectations and targets that people have to meet, and inequalities and kind of hierarchies of promotions and so on. If people's boundaries are constantly being stepped over, you will by nature will have expression of anger, which will contribute to that toxic working environment where now people will try to defend themselves, and it will come out sometimes not on purpose, but it will come out in unhealthy ways, because now everyone is there for themselves, everyone is fighting for their own interests, for their own needs. And when you do that, as we know, anger is opposite of that empathy, right? You don't see other people's point of view, you are blind to other people's needs and emotions, and sometimes unintentionally you will step over their other people in order to meet your own needs. So this is really, really interesting dynamic, how we can look at the lens of anger to really try to understand how inclusive your culture is, and or how toxic behaviors can manifest as a result of us not meeting some of these individual needs at very, very personal level.
Certainly. So I think, using anger in that context to investigate other dynamics is a really beneficial part of it. It was a really beneficial approach. So we're thinking, and we've talked about that in terms of as individuals. So for us, when we experience anger, investigating where that comes from, what belief has been contradicted, what boundary has been crossed, what is the perceived injustice here, that can give us an amazing insight into our own internal dynamics. But also, looking at how anger is expressed, and what the space is for anger in a working environment, can really reveal also a lot about the internal dynamics there. And kind of thinking, or kind of going back to maybe the roots of that anger, thinking about, when we are exploring that more, we might find that comes down to what we've been taught in early experiences. So if we grow up in households where anger is never expressed, it is always repressed, it is unacceptable to be angry, then we will learn that kind of repression. And no doubt, and often then that anger then can come out in an internalized and self-destructive, exactly, and in depression and low self-worth and things like that. But the flip side of that, if we're brought up in households in which anger is the only emotion that is expressed, and a lot of arguments are led with anger, and anger is something that is very present and not mediated or investigated within a household dynamic in the early years, then it's those same dynamics that someone will learn as they go on in their relationships, their environments later in life. So really investigating for yourself what is your relationship to anger, and what dynamics maybe in your early experiences do you feel contributed to that, and how can you start to have a little bit more control and influence over your relationship with anger?
Yeah, and anger is very powerful emotion. And when anger is an aggression, like a physical aggression, is being displayed in front of children when they are small, it can really make them feel very unsafe and very insecure. And therefore, they will do everything that they can to either prevent that from happening. And any smallest aggression or any confrontation in a conversational setting, let's say, or at work, if somebody will say, "I don't agree with you," it might feel like a very, very big threat, because that person is still associating with that aggression, even though it's displayed in a very different way. So we learn some of those social responses through some of these early environments, and we learn how to cope based on the way how other people, well, our kind of primary caregivers, helped us to meet our needs and self-regulate in the face of all those emotions, and to recognize those emotions within ourselves. Because if all you're seeing is anger, you are not actually understanding the complexity of all of the other cocktail of emotions that is underneath that is driving that expression of anger, right? And yeah, like controlling kind of anger outbursts can be quite difficult sometimes, right? And you have this concept of anger management, right? How do you manage anger? And anger is not something that needs to be managed. It's something that needs to be understood as an indicator of uh, threatened parts of your identity, right? What are parts of yourself that are not feeling safe? What are parts of you that are feeling threatened? It's like you say, like you corner the dog too far, it will bite, right? Because it has nowhere else to bite, to go, right? Nowhere else to escape. So it's like, it's in exactly the same way. You kind of train your nervous system to always go that far, and it has learned that there are no other ways. There's no other ways of escaping. I'm in a corner, right? So you don't see other options, you don't see other possibilities. Therefore, the only way is to lash out and to showcase that kind of physical violence and so on, as a way to kind of protect your own needs. So anger very often is an indicator of threat at very kind of core level of your identity in your past, in some of your early years, in some of your upbringing, or some of your past relationships, and so on. So it can be really, really interesting lens to look at, and to kind of peel those layers and see what are those things underneath.
Definitely. And in doing that, we can get better at experiencing the anger of others, and without it being such a strong trigger for either anger in ourselves or fear. And being able to allow someone to be angry, because if we understand that process of why anger is being expressed and what it's doing, and what a person might need when they're expressing anger, then we're a lot more able to sit with other people's anger. And I think that's also a really undervalued skill, is being, to be able to sit in conflict and be okay with it. Conflict is a necessary part of life. We are not all going to believe the same thing, want the same thing, have the same ideas about everything. And we are going to come into conflict, but being able to hold a space for that conflict that doesn't necessarily have to develop into anger, but also to be able to experience someone else's anger, hold a space for that, and allow that to translate into something that is constructive, can be really, really useful skill for relationships, but also for managing our own response to conflict in terms of fear and anxiety and things like that.
Yeah, and when we think about this, kind of when, why can it be so difficult to kind of self-regulate our anger, is that when we feel threatened, we automatically go into the self-protection mode. And that's when, your amygdala, your kind of threat detector part of the brain, kind of like a fire alarm kind of equivalent for our body, really goes off, and it sends all of these automatic processes, activating our HPA axis, and our kind of fight flight response, right? So we go into this automatic defense mechanism, which is governed by these automatic reptilian parts of the brain. Because if we are in kind of life-threatening danger, if somebody attacks you and you have to protect yourself, by thinking and rationalizing, shall I fly, shall I run away, shall I fight back, what is the right thing to do, you lose this crucial moment of defending yourself. So most of our defense mechanisms are, by the principle of evolution, are instant and automatic. And because they are acting out from these very kind of primal animal parts of our brain, in a way, we are not engaging with logic and reason, which means that in a moment of anger, we do things that we later regret. And we allow that, those actions to kind of take over, and we think like, oh my god, like, I don't know what's got into me, I don't understand, why did I respond to that in this specific way. So it's really, really important to understand that, we are not being, really rational, logical, and that's not really part of who we are. And sometimes, especially in relationships, we get into this anger, or like, yeah, like in a moment of anger, you said this to me, so it must be true, right? But it is not. The person will say anything in that moment to defend themselves on an impulse, on this kind of automatic response, to self-protect. And when we look at this kind of fight flight response, now we think like, okay, so how can we de-escalate it? How can we prevent this from happening? So maybe, Valentina, let's look into this. How can person kind of self-regulate their own anger? And then we can look at how can people de-escalate somebody else's anger. I hope that would be useful for those who are listening.
Yeah, certainly. So I guess if we think about our own anger first, when we experience that flood of anger, I think before anything, we just recognize it. We recognize that it's there. We can say to ourselves, oh, I'm experiencing anger. That's okay. So that next step is the acceptance. So accepting that I'm angry, and that's all right. So I'm going to give some space to that anger. And then we want to investigate it. So notice it, investigate it, ask ourselves, why am I feeling angry? And it can be really hard because, like you say, in that, when we're in this state of really heightened arousal, it can be difficult to engage these logical functions. But what I would, if you're really, really angry, things like pacing, walking up and down, being able to exert some kind of physical energy. It might be doing something like a friend of mine talked about loving kneading bread when she was really angry, because it was like she's doing something physical but can process that. So sometimes doing something physical, like any walking up and down, engaging in task, go for a run, whatever it is, while investigating the anger, asking ourselves, where has this come from? What was the external stimuli? What has that triggered in me? So how did I experience that? What was my perception of it, and what did that trigger in me? And then after a bit of a process of investigation here, then you can kind of nurture it, and you can think, okay, so I've got my anger here, I understand it, I've accepted it, and now I can look after it and fulfill it,
express it in a healthy ways, right? Like looking at this as a kind of an example of inquiry, right? What does it tell me about myself? What are some of my boundaries that have been stepped on? What are some of the things that really matters to me? And how can I protect them in a right way, right? How can I nurture some of those needs in a right way so that I don't cause the damage to myself, to others, and so on? And I think with things like anger and some other kind of very kind of powerful emotions, what is important to realize that the power of choice lies between the trigger and response. So we usually have a trigger and we go into this kind of automatic chain reaction of usual behavior, whether that's retract and hide and kind of internalize it in a destructive way, or we externalize it and, we hit something, we throw something, we shout, whatever that may be, right, in a confrontational way. And that usually kind of becomes our habitual pattern of response, right? That over the time, it just becomes stronger and stronger and stronger because we are always doing it. And it just becomes like trigger and response, trigger and response. So if we want to stop that train of thought, we know that that response is governed by this automatic process of the reptilian parts of our brain, of amygdala. Therefore, we want to re-engage back our rational logical prefrontal cortex. And we can do that by inserting a gap in between that trigger and response. So we can create rules for ourselves to say, if this happens, listing all of your triggers, then I would like to do this, this, and that to discharge my emotions healthily. And in order to make that rational decision, you need to have a gap that will allow amygdala to calm down again and to engage your rational logical part of the brain. And some of the best ways to do that could be, like Valentina said, taking some sort of action, saying, if I get angry, I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to run flight of stairs up and down. I'm going to do something. So you are actually inserting a little gap for a healthy expression of that anger, which then allows you to process what's happening and what are the better ways of responding this. But it could be as simple as saying that if I get angry, before I take any action, I will count back from 10 to 1. And then when I count it, then I will decide what to do. And sometimes that moment of pause allows us to disengage our automatic angry amygdala, that kind of threat response, come back to our safety, come back to the present moment, and engage back into this rational logical process. And when we kind of apply some of this process to other people, now it's very interesting because now we need to create a gap for that other person and hold their state in a safe manner, in a way that if somebody feels threatened, right, if we push them even more, that's going to escalate the situation. So how can we insert that gap and create a sense of safety for other person, to give them a space to process that emotion in a safe way?
So a really useful way, I mean, often it's also about reading the person and trying to read what it is that they want. But a really useful way is to just take that exactly like you would with yourself, that first step, and just recognize their anger. And you can use kind of like active listening skills to reframe what they're saying, or to sort of reword what they're saying, but reflect back essentially what they're expressing to you. So if they say, they're really angry about they're at a colleague who has not completed a piece of work, and you can say, oh, okay, so you're feeling really angry at the moment because this person that you were relying on hasn't completed their piece of work.
Yeah.
So you're not adding fuel to the fire. You're not saying,
bad. Just validating and acknowledging and actually saying it's okay to feel angry. Like we might not understand why, what is there to feel angry about, because people have different boundaries and different values, right? And what makes me angry and what makes you angry will be very different things, right? But just acknowledging that, okay, it's okay to feel angry, and having that gap to process, and just for them to kind of talk through and ask, like, what would you like to happen instead? Like, what would be the better ways of responding to this? But also to kind of finish off, I think there's very, very useful concept of physical energy that is being expressed in that. And when we feel angry, when we feel confrontational, the biggest confrontation is when somebody is standing right in front of you. Now you have energy, physical energy, really facing opposite, really opposite direction right at you, and it can escalate anger. So something very simple as that, when you are standing in front of someone physically, directly in front of them, it will always escalate anger. And just by simply moving physically and shifting to be to the side of them will, by nature of it, will de-escalate anger. And that's why if you're going to a board meeting and you know that you need to get on board, this, I don't know, opinion of specific person, and you need to really have their buy-in, you would never sit right in front of them. The best place to sit is actually next to that person, because now you are seeing, I'm on your side. We are facing the same things, the same threats together. So it's very interesting how our mind and body is wired, that even our thinking processes are influenced by our physical way of being able to show that we are either in conflict and be confrontational, or we are on your side. And it's, I think, can be very, very useful thing by simply stepping away from in front of the person and just kind of moving to the side of them, can do amazing things to de-escalate their threat response.
Absolutely. So some kind of quick, simple, easy tips there that are hopefully quite memorable. Standing to someone's side to de-escalate, and recognizing their anger without adding fuel to the fire, but validating it and saying that it's okay to feel angry with yourself. I kind of use the rain analogy, so it's recognize, accept, investigate, and nurture the emotion when it comes up, and using it as a tool for awareness. So gaining awareness around our own internal dynamics, beliefs, values, and boundaries, but also looking at how anger is received and expressed within a working dynamic, within an office environment, can be really useful for investigating those dynamics and unconscious bias.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the need to insert the gap between the trigger and response to start that RAIN process, so we can engage our rational part of the brain, and from there we can choose how we want to respond, rather than just going onto this kind of automatic train of destructive usual action.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can't believe we've been talking for nearly an hour. We really hope this has been useful and insightful. I think there's been quite a lot of practical things, as well as levels of deepening our self-awareness. So thank you very much for listening. Please feel free to share any comments, questions. Please do let us know if there are any specific topics you would like us to touch on for the next time. And we're looking forward to speaking to you next week. Bye there.
Goodbye.